Thanks, Greg. You know, I was a little bit disappointed when I got here. It's my second or third time addressing American students, but I've never been protested. You know, I was getting psyched in my hotel room, being prepared for hundreds of protesters lined up outside, you know, aggressively heckling me, shouting, screaming, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, free expression equals war. But here I am, stuck with you guys, curious, intelligent, open-minded students dedicated to advancing academic freedom. Oh well, I guess it's only my looks that resemble Ann Coulter. But seriously, it's really a great honor to be here and speak today. For the past 7 months, I've had the great pleasure and really the privilege of being a visiting fellow at FIRE, and I've experienced firsthand the incredible work that FIRE does when it comes to defending academic freedom based on a scrupulous adherence to principle over politics. And I'm confident that you too will have benefited from the spirit of putting principle over ideology that FIRE has so carefully fostered, and which really is a prerequisite for the survival of free speech. Unfortunately, I would say that FIRE's approach has become the exception in an increasingly tribalized world. Partly because in democracies, we tend to take free speech for granted. And in a certain sense, it makes sense. After all, we're immersed in speech 24/7. Access to information has never been easier. How many of you have a Kindle? So maybe 50%. With that Kindle, you can access more books than were held at the Great Library of Alexandria, which was sort of where all knowledge of the world was stored in antiquity. And you could hold more e-books in your pocket than a bibliophile Renaissance prince could ever dream of owning, and really at a fraction of the price. Before the printing press, some books cost as much as a farm, but you can just download them and have them all in your pocket. With the click of a button, you can access historical records that would have made a historian like Edward Gibbon green with envy. And no generation in the world has ever had better opportunities to interact uninhibited, directly and in real time with people across the world than you guys. So it's easy to forget that free speech is both a counterintuitive and fragile principle, and that it requires continued support against the strong and very human impulse of using force over reason, violence over words. But how many of us spend time being grateful that we don't end up in prison if we criticize our country's war efforts, as happened in this country in the early 20th century? That women are no longer put in prison for speaking out in favor of equal rights and birth control, or that we no longer face prison or even death for blasphemy or apostasy, as was the standard not that many centuries ago. So many of the ideas and values that have become mainstream and second nature in modern society were shocking, outrageous, and prohibited not that long ago. And in many places around the world, free speech is still considered a threat to communal values, national security, and so on. In fact, there are 13 countries in the world today where it's still a capital, where you still have capital punishment for blasphemy or apostasy. But still we find it difficult to imagine that the bad old days could return if we tinker around the edges of free speech protections. After all, we do it for the right reasons, right? Whereas previous generations did so based on much less progressive ideals. So what could go wrong? In fact, we live at a time where many of those who live by the pen favor governments using the sword when it comes to speech they find particularly dangerous, distasteful, offensive, hateful, propagandistic, or corrosive. The idea is spreading that free speech is being weaponized, that free speech is violence, that the media is the enemy of the people, and that social peace requires censorship rather than robust debate. Now, of course, free speech has always been controversial. It has never been universally acclaimed. But for 6 decades, free speech made almost exponential global gains in close connection with the so-called waves of democratization. These waves brought free speech to previous military dictatorships in Latin America, former communist states in Central and Eastern Europe. So from 1980 until 2003, the number of countries with a free press grew from 51 to 78. Or put differently, in 1980, 34% of the world's then 161 countries had a free press. In 2003, 41% of the world's 193 countries had newspapers free to criticize their own governments. Now, we still live in an era where free speech is riding a global high compared to previous ages. But since 2004, the respect for press freedom and free speech has been in decline globally. And in the past years, the negative development has spread from authoritarian states to the very heartland of liberal democracies. Laws against hate speech, glorification of terrorism, the denial of historical events, fake news, have proliferated and cross-fertilized between continents and regime types. Take Germany, the leader of Europe. Here, a recent law requires social media companies to remove illegal content within 24 hours, or companies like Facebook and Twitter risk a fine of 50 million euros. As a result, Facebook in Germany now operates a so-called deletion center where 1,200 people are responsible for reviewing and deleting content. Can you imagine doing that, as your full-time job, looking at cat videos and all kinds of other disgrace, and then determining, whether something breaks the law? It's probably one of the most depressing jobs I could imagine. In one case, a video documenting an anti-Semitic attack was removed, although it had actually been uploaded by a German rabbi in order to create awareness about anti-Semitism. And what happened next? Well, the German law was copied-pasted by Putin's Russia. So restrictions on free speech adopted with good intentions by democracies end up serving nefarious ends of autocracies. Illiberal measures against fake news are also mushrooming. Here in the US, Trump is largely powerless to follow through with his threats against the so-called fake news media. But in France, President Macron has announced his intention to adopt a law against false information, and Malaysia has already done so. Kenya is following suit. And in 2017, a record 262 journalists were jailed, 21 of them for disseminating false information. We can add to this the continuous threat to free speech from private actors such as terrorists, drug cartels, wealthy oligarchs, and worst of all, university administrators. So since free speech is under attack from right, left, and center, I thought I'd try to counter what I believe to be the 3 worst myths about free speech. Now, these are not the 3 commandments. My remarks are open for debate. Uncritical groupthink and sort of empty sloganeering does very little to advance the cause of free speech. And I'm not going to simply insist that the cure for bad speech is more and better speech. That won't convince many. After all, we might not even agree what is good and bad speech. And if we're serious about defending free speech, we also owe it to take the criticisms of this principle seriously and try our best to offer compelling rebuttals and persuasive justifications. I think we should work from the assumption that confirmation bias is as rampant among free speech defenders as free speech detractors. So, free speech myth number 1. Free speech protects the powerful. So I've included a little quote from a recent op-ed by a professor called Catherine McKinnon. Now, it's very often argued that free speech is about power, and I actually fully agree with that. But I fundamentally disagree that free speech is an instrument of the powerful against the powerless. I believe that claim is a historical and empirical fallacy. In fact, I will argue that free speech is one of humanity's most efficient instruments at keeping power accountable and in check. Free speech still serves the governed, not the governing. And for most of human civilization, might equaled right. Rulers were often absolute. Some of them were even divine, such as Egyptian pharaohs. And speaking truth to power entailed a death wish, which was very often granted. But then around 2,500 years ago, the Athenian democracy emerged. And in Athens, equality of speech, called isagoria, and uninhibited speech, called paresia, were integral parts of the egalitarian and democratic political culture, which allowed every free Athenian male a voice in politics and communal affairs. Of course, you could say Athenian equality falls pretty far short of our standards, but in its day, the egalitarian nature of Athenian democracy and free speech was radical. In fact, a much higher proportion of Athenians had a vote than Americans in the early days of the Republic, because you didn't have to own property to go and vote as an Athenian in their direct democracy. The Athenian orator Demosthenes laid out the stark difference between democratic Athens and its oligarchic enemies in Sparta. In Athens, you were free to criticize the Athenian constitution and praise the Spartan alternative. But in Sparta, praising any other constitution than the Spartan was prohibited. Now, Demosthenes' observation is 2,300 years old, but I think his description could still apply to the differences between modern democracies and autocracies. So you, as Americans, high or low, are free to criticize your own constitution, and if you so wish, you could advocate its replacement with Chinese-style one-party rule. But if you're Chinese, and you're a dissident, and you want American-style democracy, you're going to end up behind bars. And when the Athenian democracy was twice overthrown by oligarchs, it was exactly because the rich and powerful found it unacceptable that the poor and illiterate should have an equal voice. So from the very birth of free speech, it was actually an egalitarian idea meant to keep the powerful in check. The close relationship between restrictions of free speech and entrenchment of power was perhaps best demonstrated by the prosecution of British deists who sold Tom Paine's The Age of Reason to the lower classes in the early 19th century. One guy was a guy called Richard Taylor. He spent on off 10 years in prison for selling copies of Tom Paine. And a British prosecutor laid out the case of why it was so dangerous for Richard Taylor and the like to sell Tom Paine to the poor classes. And I've taken this quote from the prosecutor. When such terrible productions are put into the hands of those who, unlike the rich, the informed, and the powerful, are unable to draw distinctions between ingenious, though mischievous arguments and divine truth, the consequences are too frightful to be contemplated. So that, that's an open and shut admission that censorship, the basis of censorship, was basically to keep power entrenched in a class society like they had in the UK at the time. My home country, Denmark, is perhaps the most iconic example of a social democratic welfare state with very high levels of equality, generous benefits, universal health care, and free university education. In fact, in Denmark, we get paid to go to university. We get around $1,000 a month when you enroll in university, no tuition fees. But in the 1870s, the founders of the Social Democratic Labour Party were systematically persecuted by conservative Danish governments. and they were sentenced to years in prison for their subversive activities, and the party was banned and dissolved. Of course, now it's the party that has been in government for the longest time since Denmark became a democracy. Okay, so those were the historical examples, and that's all very well, you might say. But today's free speech cases typically protect the rights of bigots rather than proponents of social justice. So what was a worthy fight centuries ago now undermines all the hard-won achievements of those past struggles. I think it's probably true that legal decisions establishing the rights of workers to picket, march, and demonstrate are rare. But that's because these battles have already been won at the courts in most liberal democracies. Isn't it freedom of association that has allowed workers to organize and labor unions to challenge big business? Isn't it free speech and assembly that allows Americans to expose, protest, and ultimately force the government to end the practice of separating young, vulnerable immigrant children from their parents? And isn't it exactly the exercise of free speech that has allowed postmodernist critical theory to gain traction at universities and in the media? Laws against defamation and libel are particularly good to demonstrate how free speech is a protection against power. So if you're an American president, you have to put up with being called a traitor. You have to put up with fanciful stories about you being born in different countries than the U.S. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it, no matter how often these lies or conspiracy theories are spread on cable news and the internet. But if you're the president of Turkey, Erdogan, you can put people in prison when they insult you. So actually, Turkish President Erdogan has filed more than 2,000 cases for people insulting him, some of them school children, and one of them a singer, a popular singer who was sent to prison in 10 months for insulting Erdogan. So that to me is a very good example of free speech not being for the power, protecting the powerless in this country, but and restrictions on free speech protecting power in Turkey. But it is of course true that the rich and the powerful can also avail themselves of free speech to promote their interests. I think, first of all, that being rich and powerful is not necessarily nefarious in itself. Obviously, the rich and the powerful should have a right to spread their ideas as well. But without free speech, only the powerful would have access to speech, because almost by definition, it will be those in power who determine the red lines. Without a commitment to free speech guided by universality and viewpoint neutrality, one source of oppressive power will simply replace another. I think the best example might be the communist revolutions since 1917, which have proven beyond any doubt that privileging those classes who have previously been exploited and oppressed at expense of their oppressors, real or imagined, does nothing to ensure fairness, justice, or equal access to speech. Being executed by Bolsheviks rather than the Tsar is not really progress in my book. But even if we could reach agreement that in good faith that limits on free speech should be tailored to privilege the powerless at the expense of the powerful, it's not clear how you objectively define these categories. Who is powerful, who is powerless? And how should an individual's position on the sliding scale between powerless and powerful affect their free speech rights? So arguably, Black Lives Matter have more power in terms of influence and mainstream acceptance than the remnants of the KKK. If I'm right, should the KKK then enjoy better free speech protection than Black Lives Matter? Or should we go down the road where the degree of free speech enjoyed by each of us is determined by taking into account more permanent characteristics, such as race, gender, and ethnicity? That approach actually seems to have appeal at certain universities and colleges. But what would it entail in practice? So my father is a Black African Muslim. My mother is a white Christian woman, white European woman. Does that mean I should be protected against derogatory statements against blacks and Muslims, but have to suffer hate speech against white Christians? Although I identify as neither black, white, Muslim, or Christian, but as Jacob Mchangama, a Danish citizen who loves his family, is interested in history, likes New York, and believes in freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Maybe we could ask Silicon Valley to solve this problem by creating an algorithm determining free speech rights based on a sophisticated tabulations of power distributions. And I'd be okay with that as long as I get to program it. The unintended consequences of abandoning current free speech protections should worry Americans of all stripes. I think very likely a less robust First Amendment would result in vastly different regimes of censorship across the US along sort of tribalist lines. So consider that 45% of Republicans said in an Economist poll that they favored allowing courts to shut down news media for publishing stories that are biased and inaccurate. That's pretty crazy. Presumably they hold this opinion because CNN, Washington Post, and New York Times are enemies of the people due to their criticism of the president. And then on the other hand, a majority of Californian Democrats favor hate speech restrictions aimed at far-right groups. So I imagine America would be a country where in the liberal coastal states, you might have sort of European-style hate speech laws protecting racial, sexual minorities and groups, whereas in the South, you might have laws protecting national symbols and values, and maybe throw in, you know, a prohibition against the construction of mosques or whatever some majority could figure up. I think that is really what would be weaponizing free speech. And this leads me to free speech myth number 2. Free speech hurts vulnerable groups and minorities. It's of course a myth that is closely related to myth number 1. But is it true? Again, I would say that the historical record, at least to me, heavily suggests that this interpretation is wrong. And forgive me for going back into history, but that's, you know, what I do most of my time with the podcast, so I plead guilty to being a bit geeky on that. In 1860, an abolitionist meeting in Boston was violently disrupted by white business owners and their thugs, who feared that their commercial interests in the South would be jeopardized by abolitionist rhetoric. Now, one of those who was present and who was being heckled to silence was none other than Frederick Douglass, former slave, and perhaps America's most eloquent abolitionist. Now, the humiliation of being heckled with impunity caused Douglass to pen his famous speech, A Plea for Free Speech in Boston, which I really think everyone should read if you haven't already. Because it's a passionate defense of free speech as being the instrument of the weak against the powerful and unjust, and as a weapon against slavery. This quote struck me when I read the speech for the first time, but I really think you should read the whole speech because it's a very, very effective rebuttal of the idea that minorities and traditionally oppressed minorities should be in favor of restricting free speech. Of course, the abolition of slavery did not do away with racism and discrimination in the US. But in the fight against segregation, free speech was once again the ally of racial justice, and repression the preferred tool of supremacists. One woman who I am really impressed with, she's a real badass, was Ida B. Wells, who traveled around the South and somehow found the courage to, through journalism, document the sickening extent of lynchings and also exposing sort of the sick excuses that were being made for lynchings, that, you know, it was black people who were sort of sexual predators when in reality it was a policy to keep black people down. But obviously, white people, a lot of white people didn't like her journalism. They didn't like that this sick phenomenon was being exposed. So what happened? Well, whites retaliated by burning down her newspaper. And what was her newspaper called? Does anyone know? It was called Free Speech. And she had to flee north to Chicago when she was met by an avalanche of death threats. In the 20th century, thousands of blacks were arrested across the South for protesting segregation. In the 60s, for instance, several black activists, including MLK, were arrested for praying outside City Hall in Albany, Georgia. Other civil rights activists were arrested for distributing literature without a permit, interesting doctrine, and one for holding a sign with the words, "One man, one vote," which of course is also clearly subversive. Now, these outrageous denials of free speech had to be defeated in federal courts as Southern judges turned a blind eye to the First Amendment. Okay, so we have seen that historically, again, the fight for racial justice has been fought with the First Amendment and free speech, as Ira also told us yesterday. But you could argue that this development has served as a Trojan horse for racists, and that Americans have become more bigoted as the Supreme Court has extended the protection of the First Amendment. Of course, that would be wrong. If you look at racist hate crimes, according to the FBI statistics, they have fallen 48% between 1994 and 2015. And if you look at white supremacist rallies, not only in the US, but generally in Western Europe, there's one constant feature of those rallies, is that racists wearing white hoods or waving swastikas or Confederate flags are always outnumbered by anti-racist counter-demonstrators. In 1958, only 4% of Americans supported interracial marriages. In 1997, the figure was 50%. Today, it's almost 90%. Among your generation, it's more than 94% that don't have a problem with someone marrying someone from a different race. This trend is also apparent when it comes to the acceptance of homosexuality, anti-Semitism. In fact, when you look at the World Values Survey that measures attitudes in all countries around the world, there seems to be a general correlation between a country's respect for free speech and its citizens' commitment to progressive values towards gender, minorities, sexual orientation. That does not exactly suggest that racism is on the rise. Now, of course, correlation does not mean causation, but I think those who believe that too much free speech spreads racism and intolerance should rely on more than abstract arguments and elaborate theories with little empirical support to make the case. Before wishing to adopt laws against hate speech and offense, I think Americans should also want to take a look at Europe, where such laws have been on the books for years in order to protect minorities against history repeating itself. Of course, some of those who are targeted by hate speech laws in Europe are bona fide Nazis. But hate speech and offense laws also tend to undergo what I call scope creep. So in Sweden, there's a particularly provocative artist who was sent to jail for exhibiting posters with caricatures of prominent black Swedes at a gallery. But not only was this artist sent to jail, the gallery owner was also convicted and the posters were ordered destroyed by the police. Pretty far-ranging. In 2017, British police detained and questioned more than 3,300 people for grossly offensive comments on social media. Sorry. This is an actual tweet from the police in Scotland. Please be aware that we will continue to monitor comments on social media, and any offensive comments will be investigated. I mean, can you imagine a police force sending out something like that in this country? So that's roughly 9 arrests a day for social media posts in the United Kingdom. One of those who was actually convicted was a British YouTuber who had posted a video in which, as a joke, he had taught his girlfriend's dog to perform a Nazi salute and respond to anti-Semitism. I mean, pretty twisted thing to do, but quite clearly not meant seriously as anti-Semitism. Another left-wing student was charged for sarcastically using the Twitter hashtag #KillAllWhiteMen. But you might say, okay, so there are a few cases where we go a bit too far, but might these cases not be worth the price in order to protect minorities and assuring them of their equal status and standing in society? And I think you shouldn't underestimate the hurt that you can feel, especially as a minority, when you're subjected to hate speech and derogatory statements. Being in a minority and subjected to such speech clearly can hurt, can make you feel like an outsider, like feeling less than a full member of society. But limiting free speech to protect minorities from racism and offense is a very dangerous game. Let me give you a good example, and not just sort of the abstract, theoretical, slippery slope argument. So in my home country, Denmark, you may remember that a Danish newspaper in 2005 published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, and all hell broke loose. At the time, Danish Muslims overwhelmingly opposed not only the actual publication, but also the right of the newspaper to do so. And the newspaper's editor, who's a good friend of mine and who Greg also knows quite well, was reported to the police. Muslim groups tried to have the newspaper, the editor, convicted for both blasphemy and hate speech. Now, at the time, that was roundly rejected by politicians and so on in Denmark. But now things have sort of changed in Denmark. We have problems with integration, with radicalism. We've had terrorist attacks, and so the current center-right government in Denmark has passed more restrictions on free speech, legal restrictions on free speech, than any other government since World War II. And all these laws are in practice aimed at Muslims. So we have a law which says that if you're a religious preacher, and as part of religious preaching, you expressly condone certain illegal acts, including polygamy, you could go to jail for 3 years. And that is, even though it's neutral on the face of it, no one is in doubt that that is specifically aimed at Muslim so-called hate preachers. We also recently banned the so-called burqa or niqab, sort of the face covering veil. Again, on the face of it, a neutral law, because explicitly aiming it at Muslims would be unconstitutional. But all politicians would openly admit that the only reason we're introducing this law is to target the 100 women, perhaps in Denmark, who were such. So, by abandoning principle, Danish Muslims have essentially helped pave the way for majoritarian laws aimed at themselves. I think the reaction would have been very different if the majority of Danish Muslims had said at the time, we find these cartoons offensive, we don't like them, but we accept that this is the price of living in a secular democracy. We have the right to practice our faith the way that we want, and some might be offended by that. They may not like our faith, and the price of us being able to do that is that people can criticize our faith. Then I think things might have looked differently. Instead of free speech, being win-win, it has become sort of a zero-sum game, and that is a very dangerous game to play when you're a minority. And there are other forces in Europe. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Dutch politician called Geert Wilders. Few of you. So he's a very sort of anti-immigrant, anti-Islam politician who talks a lot about free speech when he himself is the target, and he's been prosecuted a number of times for hate speech. But at the same time, he wants to ban the Quran and he wants to ban the construction of mosques. And I wouldn't bet against him succeeding with that if things continue to sort of spiral out of control in Europe. And again, the only way you could stop someone like him was a principled defense of free speech. So the freedoms that allow bigots to bait minorities are also the very freedoms that allow Muslims, Jews, and so on to practice their faith freely. And by eroding these freedoms, no one is more than a political majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of laws against hatred and offense. Okay, that brings me to the last myth, free speech myth. Free speech is violence. And, misspelled Thomas Hobbes. Sorry about that. But I find this quote from Thomas Hobbes quite interesting, and I'll follow it up by another quote by a guy called Anthony Leaker. How many of you know Thomas Hobbes? Everyone, of course. So for Hobbes, speech, especially religious speech, was an overt physical act and disagreement almost indistinguishable from violence. So to avoid such violence, Hobbes was in favor of pretty extreme censorship, I have to say. Oh, sorry, yeah. Licensing of preachers, licensing of books. But he also says somewhere that it would have been better to kill 1,000 unruly preachers so as to avoid the religious wars that killed 100,000 people. So that's pretty extreme measures. The other guy that I quoted, Anthony Leaker, is a British academic who's not yet as famous as Hobbes. He's writing a book. He's written a book that comes out soon called Against Free Speech. And I think it's quite interesting that if you strip away the sort of impenetrable postmodernist critical theory lingo that academics such as Leaker uses, it seems to me that the idea that hate speech can be a form of violence is positively Hobbesian in nature. Even though I think certain progressives might be horrified to learn that their ideas stem from a long dead and privileged white man. I mean, that might be the best argument if you say, well, someone like Hobbes said that, oh, okay, I'm going to change my mind. But the leakers of the world are not alone. A 2017 Yale study among 800 college students showed that 84% agreed with the statement, words can be a form of violence. But what is the relationship between free speech and violence? That's a notoriously difficult subject to measure, and it's probably impossible to say with any scientific certainty. Nonetheless, there are actually a number of studies that shed light on whether free speech tends to fan the flame of violence or instead act as a safety valve. Although, again, we should be humble about using these studies to make sweeping and general statements. But first off, can speech lead to violence? And here I would say unequivocally, yes. There's a reason even the First Amendment does not protect incitement to imminent violence if the words spoken are likely to incite or produce such action. The Harvard scholar Suzanne Benesch has defined the term dangerous speech, which she finds occurrences of dangerous speech is a reliable predictor of outbreaks of violent conflict, including genocide. One of the characteristics is that the speech in question must be understood as incitement to violence. But even speech that doesn't reach that threshold may cause people to react violently. So you have example of Islamist terrorists who say they were motivated to go to carry out terrorism because they saw pictures on TV of Muslims being killed in Syria or other places. I mean, there's no incitement there. It's just something happened that triggered something in them. So in other words, I think you should be very dismissive of free speech activists who claim that speech can never lead to conflict or violence. I think that's simply wrong. But the fact that certain forms of speech may lead to violent conflict does not necessarily mean that limiting free speech through censorship will reduce the risk of violence. In fact, several studies suggest that in liberal democracies, free speech protections tend to be associated with lower levels of violence and restrictions with higher risks of violence. Only in more authoritarian states do we find that loosening censorship may sometimes increase the risk of conflict. So why would free speech reduce rather than increase the risk of violence? I'd say a qualified guess is that free speech allows grievances to be voiced before they boil over and turn violent. In fact, one of the world's most celebrated freedom fighters has given an eloquent explanation of why it is the denial rather than the protection of free speech that leads to violence. I'm talking, of course, about South African freedom fighter Nelson Mandela. In 1964, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for sabotage, and he delivered a very famous speech at his trial in which he justified using violence against the apartheid regime with these words: "All lawful modes of expressing opposition to white supremacy had been closed by legislation, and we were placed in a position in which we had either to accept a permanent state of inferiority or to defy the government." So if Nelson Mandela, who is a pretty nonviolent guy under normal circumstances, found violence legitimate in the absence of free speech, I don't think it should surprise us if groups and individuals who are motivated by much less noble goals than Mandela would think so too, even when their censors are democratically elected governments rather than authoritarian supremacists. But being subjected to different and sharply conflicting opinions may also open our minds and make us feel less threatened by people who hold radically different ideas than ourselves when it comes to religion or politics. After all, few people in the West still worry about the theological differences between feuding Christian sects that fuel religious wars of the past. There was a time in Europe where you would be killed and where wars would be waged if you answered incorrectly to the question of infant baptism, the Holy Trinity, or whether wafers and altar blood became the actual body and blood of Christ. That tends not to be heated discussions in the West anymore. But it was exactly these kinds of conflicts that caused Hobbes to favor censorship or even the killing of theological loudmouths in order to avoid mass conflict. So if we reset our brains to tribalist mode, civilization will likely be more violent and less diverse, prosperous, intelligent, and fun. And I think it's to humanity's immense benefit that we have taught our brains to interpret differences in opinion as a sign of progress and enrichment rather than as a sign of mortal danger to be confronted with force. And I think, Greg, you've said it better than anyone, that free speech really is the antithesis of violence. Now, I'll grant you, free speech is often messy. I understand the impulse to censor the speech we hate. But I hope to have offered some arguments as to why the dangers of censorship outweigh the uncertain advantages. And I'm not a US citizen, but if I were, I would actually shudder at the thought of weakening the protection of free speech in these times of extreme political tribalism, identity politics, and polarization. In a situation where the president has threatened to change libel laws, where some of your students demand ideological purity on campuses, where accusations of treasons are flying left, right, and center, where good faith, consistency, and principle in political discourse has become a rare commodity, it seems to me that the First Amendment is also the first line of defense of American freedom and democracy. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions. I'd be happy to hear your comments and thoughts.
Hello. Coming from the perspective of a student journalist, What do you make of the headlines coming out of American universities that are at best unfriendly toward the free expression and free speech on campuses, and how does that compare to what you experience in Denmark?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see these kind of reactions. You know, when people are being no platformed, or when you have the idea of microaggressions and so on, sort of some of the very extreme examples of coming out of Yale and so on, because that's something that's completely alien to Denmark. I think you get some of it in the UK, but not to the same level as in the US. So it's quite interesting that the US has, you know, the best legal protection of free speech, but also has a culture, at least in certain places. I mean, generally Americans tend to favor strong free speech protections compared to anywhere else, but that you have a strong culture in certain environments that go against that. It's something that can be a little bit difficult to understand. But you know, I don't focus specifically on academic freedom, but it seems to me that it's an extremely important fight, because if those who want to have more restrictions on free speech at universities succeed, if that becomes the pervasive culture over time, that's also going to be, you know, your politicians, your judges, and so on. And you know, when you look at the history of the First Amendment, then it's quite clear that the current protections were not always there. I mean, it's a fairly recent phenomenon that you have as strong free speech protections as you do now. So there's no natural law saying that in 20 years you can't have, you know, 5 justices who have a completely different conception of free speech. So in that sense, I think it's absolutely crucial that academic freedom be upheld. It's a crucial way of maintaining that culture of a strong First Amendment, because ultimately, I think it's the culture, it's the attitudes towards free speech that are decisive. You can't have free speech upheld by 5 judges at the Supreme Court. Ultimately, it has to be a value that is accepted by the majority of people in a given country.
So a lot of your presentation was focused on sort of the real consequences of free speech, and that sort of results oriented, that free speech is good for these reasons. But for you personally, do you think free speech and free expression is sort of a natural right for people? Do you think beyond the results, beyond how it's good maybe for democracy, do people have a right to this expression from your own personal perspective and research and how you're interested in this?
Yeah, you know, it's a very good question. I've probably become more of a consequentialist than I was before doing the podcast. I used to think of free speech mostly in moral terms as being, you know, having to do with autonomy, really a manifestation of freedom of conscience, which is very deep and has to do with individual autonomy. I think at the current state of my thinking of free speech, and I change my mind, you know, a lot as I do the podcast. I think, you know, that there are a number of really strong justifications, and I think they're mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. So I don't think that you have to come down and sort of say free speech can only be justified according to this or that reason. I think there are a number of really strong justifications, some of them moral, some of them more consequentialist, and I think when you put them together, you'd make an even more persuasive case for free speech. So yes, I think that free speech is a very important individual right, but I don't think that sums up free speech such. I think you have to have the consequentialist arguments there, and I have probably begun leaning a bit more towards the consequentialist side than the purely sort of moral side that I emphasized more previously. Maybe maybe I'll swing back at the end of the podcast. Who knows?
Hey, thanks so much for coming. So my question is, based on where we are right now, where Europe, especially Ireland and Scotland and England, where their attitudes towards free speech, legally speaking, are pretty antithetical, it seems, to free speech in a lot of cases. Do you see any possibility of these countries opening up to the reversal of these anti-free speech laws and provisions in the near future, in the distant future, at all, ever, under what manifestations? And how do you think such a movement could successfully push for the reversal of such antithetical free speech laws and for the adoption of free speech laws?
Good question. I mean, first of all, let me put things in perspective. Like, if you look at Western Europe, liberal democracies, you still have strong free speech protections. I don't want to make sort of the hysterical, alarmist case that, you know, you can't say anything. Generally, if you go to Germany, if you go to France, if you go to Denmark, you still have very robust political debate, and it's not like if you say something against the Prime Minister of Denmark, you're going to find yourself in jail. But the trend is nonetheless, as I described it, that more and more restrictions on free speech are coming. I think particularly the idea of fake news, laws against fake news is extremely dangerous. So what are can that be reversed? In the short and medium term, I don't see that. I see more signs of things going in the other directions, because you have a terrorist threat, which is real. As you've seen, there have been a lot of terrorist attacks, not in the past year so much, but still, they're there. You've always become sort of, only 5 people died when it's a European terrorist attack, and that is a driver of restrictions on free speech. Then you have a fear of populism, which is a driver of restrictions on free speech, and then you have a certain particular European approach to multiculturalism, which builds partly on the idea that for people of different cultures, ethnicities, and so on to be able to live together in peace, you have to restrict speech in order that they don't offend each other, in order to ensure social peace. Sort of Hobbes light, you could call it, and there's so much uncertainty in Europe at the moment. Things are so much up in the air that I don't see that we have the states are confident enough to do it to sort of loosen up free speech protections. So I don't know what would be the development that's on the horizon that would drive stronger free speech protections. I mean, it's clear that, like, here in the U.S., if you go to the 60s, like the civil rights movement, it's a really powerful case for strengthening free speech, as attitudes towards these questions sort of change. It was a sort of progressive agenda that drove these things. It's very difficult for a politician to get up there and say, well, yes, we have terrorist attacks and we have these people who want to establish a caliphate, let's have free speech. So a lot of the people that for instance, when he had the cartoon crisis, a lot of people were sort of saying free speech is important. We should never give up on free speech. But those people now are the first to say, we can't have free speech when you have religious fundamentalists running around, so I'm very much in the minority, sort of standing up for free speech, even for Islamists, for instance. So I'm a bit pessimistic in the short and medium term. I think you might see, like, if populists come into government in more places, they might loosen up sort of hate speech laws that tend to target far right groups, but then at the same time they'll adopt a lot of free speech restrictions against their adversaries. So that's not going to be a net win for free speech.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to myth 3, free speech is violence. That's one I run into a lot at my campus. And more Leaker's version, which isn't even that it leads to violence, but that the words themselves are violence, that the words themselves do harm that is violent. And I find that insane, but I sometimes have trouble articulating why it's so. And if you could speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I think words certainly can can hurt. I think, there are lots of words that could be said to me that would hurt me a lot more than someone punching me in the face, like words like "I don't love you anymore," or what's his name, the professor who was physically attacked, was it at Middlebury? Okay, so she was physically attacked. But if you're a professor, it might be more hurtful if someone, you had a brilliant career in academia and someone comes along and shows that all your research results were just wrong. That would hurt a lot more than being punched in the face by a student. But that hurt is deeply subjective. So if you're a religious person and someone says something about your religious belief, that might hurt a lot. But to me, it wouldn't. It wouldn't hurt me at all. So I think it's very, it's very difficult to operationalize that hurt and sort of qualify it as a harm that should be remedied through legal measures. Even though I completely agree that words can actually hurt, and they can hurt a lot, and they don't. That hurt is not. They are not limited to what some would call hate speech. So in that sense, I don't see them as violence. I acknowledge that they can cause. They can hurt you, but I wouldn't qualify them as a harm in the sense that violence, physical violence would be. I don't know if that makes sense. But I do think that I don't think, if you're a free speech activist, I don't think you should sort of the whole sort of saying, well, they're snowflakes or social justice. Well, I don't think it's an effective strategy, and I think all of us could pinpoint a moment where someone has said something to us that really hurt us deeply, and that might have hurt a lot more than being punched in the face, actually. But again, you can't operationalize it, and sometimes it's good to be hurt by word. I mean, sometimes someone tells you something that really hurts you, but it helps you move on because maybe you were acting like an asshole and you were told so, and it made you think about stuff, and it made you develop as a person. It typically doesn't help you develop very much if someone beats the shit out of you.
Hi, over here. Here.
Yeah, sorry.
You said earlier that increasing free speech in liberal democracies tends to reduce violence in those countries. But then you said that increasing free speech in authoritarian states could have the effect of increasing violence. Could you explain what you meant?
Yeah, I mean, these are sort of, I don't think I can sort of look at and isolate causes, but I would say a good example might be Myanmar, where you had increasing press freedom, and where you see a lot of hate speech against the Rohingya Muslim minority spreading on Facebook, that a lot of people have said this has contributed to what some have called sort of genocide-like situation. So it's countries that don't have the institutions that are normally associated with liberal democracy, that don't have a tradition of tolerance, so that may be some of the reasons why this happens. It's not an iron law. It's not a certainty that these things will happen, but that's what the data shows.
Yeah, so in regards to your point about, I guess, hearing things that hurt and then moving on and growing from them, I think that, and then the example you gave about, for example, your loved one telling you that she doesn't love you anymore, I think that's a little bit offensive. I think it's a little bit tone deaf to use that as an example. Because when people say free speech is violence, they're not talking about those things. They're talking about comments that make an unsafe environment for minorities, and that's a very real problem. I think what you were trying to get at, if I understand correctly, is that that speech should be protected, but harassment laws are still valid. I just think that was a little tone deaf, if I'm to be completely honest. Sorry.
No, that's good. I think that's why we're here discussing these issues. So I think that's a good point. I'm sorry if I was being tone deaf. My example was merely that I don't think you can say, I think it's very subjective, and it depends a lot on the person whether a particular statement will be hurtful, will be deemed offensive or not. And I think it's very difficult to operationalize it. So I acknowledge that, like I said, sure, it can be hurtful if you're a minority and someone says something, but then you have the whole problem of defining, what are the words that
It's a little defined, right? Because certain words like the N-word, or in regards to the LGBT community, the F-word, I think it already is defined. So
legally defined.
not legally defined, but I think it's very socially obvious that that's not an acceptable thing to say to someone.
Sure, and I'm not saying that we should all sort of turn into people with Tourette's and say whatever comes into. I think there's a very important social value in being polite and speaking to each other respectfully. So I think that's a very important good, being respectful of other people, being civil. But I would say when that good clashes with free speech, I would say that free speech is more important than being civil and being respectful. But I think that's something. Being civil, being respectful, is an important virtue that we should foster. And I don't think there's anything wrong with if someone used the N-word. I don't think there's anything wrong with you saying, okay, I'm not going to be around that person if you use that kind of language. If those are the views that you hold, then you're not someone I'm going to spend my time on, and I'm going to tell it to your face that I find that socially unacceptable. But I wouldn't argue in favor of that person being put in jail.
Hi. Thank you again for coming. You obviously are an avid historian and someone that's very attuned to, it seems, to all parts of history. So I was curious, what do you think is more important? The making of history in terms of having a forward-looking worldview and world perspective, or the preservation of it? And I think they can be very interrelated, but also isolated in terms of worldviews and how, our generation should look towards progress. Should we look to the past and take cues from Hobbes and,
Don't take cues from Hobbes.
Right, or not from Hobbes.
On free speech.
I looked at your PowerPoint, it's the first thing I thought of. Or the late Mandela, or should we look towards, future goals that we should have as students and as, the next presidents of the United States?
I think you should definitely look to history, I think there are many powerful instances in American history, both really bad examples that I don't think you should copy, but also very powerful examples like, civil rights movement is obviously a very strong example, I think, of really where you could say, civil rights movement. I mean, I'm not an expert, but from my reading on it shows that you can have progressive ideals without sacrificing free speech, and that in fact these two things can reinforce each other. I think that's a very important lesson that I would take with me if I were you and doing what you do. Of course, I'm not a historian. I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm not a historian. As Dan Carlin would say, if you listen to history podcasts, you can have a lot of different opinions on what should a lesson be of a specific historical event. But yes, I think history is really enriching for human beings, like putting things in context and being aware that you're not the first generation in the history of the world, and smart people have grappled with things before, and you might actually learn something from their struggles and how they've dealt with issues before.
We have time for one more question.
I was wondering if you could talk about some historical examples, especially a notable one would be Iran, which was very progressive in the 1970s and kind of developed into a more a different society where free speech wasn't allowed. Another one would be Russia. Do you have any good examples that could talk about it swinging the other way, which I think some of us might see within our lifetimes in Europe and the United States?
Yeah, so countries becoming more free speech. Yeah, but like I said, you had these waves of democratization that swept through the world that were very positive. And I mean, the latest examples were, the democratization of Central and Eastern Europe, where countries that had been living under communism also had free speech. Sadly, you have countries like Poland and Hungary, even the Czech Republic, where free speech is really being undermined. Which I think is a really sad development. I would hope that a country like Venezuela, when it has hit rock bottom, which can't be far away, I would hope that that's a country where you could see where it wouldn't take much to improve things in Venezuela when it comes to free speech. So that might be a case where we say in 5 or 10 years. Hopefully, things have become better. That might be one country. Maybe Tunisia, as the one sort of qualified moderate success story of the Arab Spring, as a country that has actually taken some steps that I think are positive. It would be great to see Tunisia being a even more stable democracy with free speech in 10 years as a really positive example for the region.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jacob.